Section 31 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since, Volume 2 by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 66. Now Cupid, a child of conscience, he makes restitution. Shakespeare. Mr. Duncan Macwheeble, no longer commissary or baillie, though still enjoying the empty name of the latter dignity, had escaped prosecution by an early succession from the insurgent party, and by his insignificance. Edward found him in his office, immersed among papers and accounts. Before him was a large bicker of oatmeal porridge, and at the side therefore of a horn spoon and a bottle of 2-penny. Eagerly running his eye over a voluminous law paper, he from time to time shovelled an immense spoonful of these nutritive viands into his capacious mouth. A pot-bellied Dutch bottle of brandy, which stood by, intimated either that this honest limb of the law had taken his morning already, or that he meant to season his porridge with such digestive, or perhaps both circumstances might reasonably be inferred. His nightcap and morning gown had whilom been of tartan, but, equally cautious and frugal, the honest baillie had got them dyed black, lest their original ill-omened colour might remind his visitors of his unlucky excursion to Derby. To sum up the picture, his face was daubed with snuff up to the eyes, and his fingers with ink up to the knuckles. He looked dubiously at Waverley as he approached the little green rail which fenced his desk and stool from the approach of the vulgar. Nothing could give the baillie more annoyance than the idea of his acquaintance being claimed by any of the unfortunate gentlemen who were now so much more likely to need assistance than to afford profit. But this was the rich young Englishman, who knew what might be his situation. He was the Baron's friend too. What was to be done? While these reflections gave an air of absurd perplexity to the poor man's visage, Waverley, reflecting on the communication he was about to make to him, of a nature so ridiculously contrasted with the appearance of the individual, could not help bursting out a-laughing, as he checked the propensity to exclaim with Syphax, "Cato's a prosper person to entrust a love-tale with." As Mr. Macwheeble had no idea of any person laughing heartily who was either encircled by peril or oppressed by poverty, the hilarity of Edward's countenance greatly relieved the embarrassment of his own, and giving him a tolerably hearty welcome to Little Veolan, he asked what he would choose for breakfast. His visitor had, in the first place, something for his private ear, and begged leave to bolt the door. Duncan by no means liked this precaution, which savoured of a danger to be apprehended, but he could not now draw back. Convinced he might trust this man, as he could make it his interest to be faithful, Edward communicated his present situation and future schemes to Macwheeble. The wily agent listened with apprehension when he found Waverley was still in a state of proscription, was somewhat comforted by learning that he had a passport, rubbed his hands with glee when he mentioned the amount of his present fortune, opened huge eyes when he heard the brilliancy of his future expectations, but when he expressed his intention to share them with Miss Rose Bradwardine, ecstasy had almost deprived the honest man of his senses. The baillie started from his free-footed stool like the pythoness from her tripod, flung his best wig out of the window because the block on which it was placed stood in the way of his career, chucked his cap to the ceiling, caught it as it fell, whistled "Tallegot Joram," danced a Highland fling with immediate grace and agility, and then threw himself exhausted into a chair, exclaiming, "Lady Waverley, 10,000 a year, the least penny! Lord preserve my poor understanding!" "Amen, with all my heart," said Waverley. "But now, Mr. Macwheeble, let us proceed to business." This word had somewhat a sedative effect, but the Bailie's head, as he expressed himself, was still "in the bee's knees." He mended his pen, however, marked half a dozen sheets of paper with an ample marginal fold, wiped down Dallas of St. Martin's Styles from a shelf where that venerable work roosted with Stair's Institutions, Darleton's Doubts, Balfour's Practices, and a parcel of old account books, opened the volume at the article Contract of Marriage, and prepared to make what he called a smart minute to prevent parties frae weaseling. With some difficulty Waverley made him comprehend that he was going a little too fast. He explained to him that he should want his assistance, in the first place, to make his residence safe for the time, by writing to the officer at Tullyveoline that Mr. Stanley, an English gentleman nearly related to Colonel Talbot, was upon a visit of business at Mr. Macwheeble's, and, knowing the state of the country, had sent his passport for Captain Foster's inspection. This produced a polite answer from the officer, with an invitation to Mr. Stanley to dine with him, which was declined, as may easily be supposed, under pretence of business. Waverley's next request was that Mr. Macwheeble would dispatch a man and horse to the post town at which Colonel Talbot was to address him, with directions to wait there until the post should bring a letter for Mr. Stanley, and then to forward it to Little Veolan with all speed. In a moment the Bailie was in search of his apprentice, or servitor as he was called 60 years since. Stock scriever, and in not much greater space of time Jock was on the back of the white pony. "Take care ye guide him weel, sir, for he's aye been short in the wind since our Lord be guide to me," in a low voice. "I was going to come out wi' since I rode whip and spur to fetch the Chevalier to red Mr. Waverley and Vinch Lanfort, and an uncanny coop I gat for my pains. Lord forgive your honour, I might have broken my neck, but troth it was in a venture, may ways no an, but this makes amends for a Lady Waverley, 10,000 a year. Lord be guide unto me." "But you forget, Mr. Macwheeble, we want the Baron's consent. The ladies—" "Never fear, I'se be caution for them. I'se gie you my personal warrandice, 10,000 a year. It dings Balmawhapple out and out. A year's rent's worth a Balmawhapple, fee and life rent. Lord, make us thankful." To turn the current of his feelings, Edward inquired if he had heard anything lately of the chieftain of Glennaquoich. "Not one word," answered Macwheeble, "but that he was still in Carlisle Castle, and was soon to be panelled for his life. I dinna wish the young gentleman ill," he said, "but I hope that they that hae got him will keep him, and no let him back to this Highland border to plague us wi' blackmail and a manner o' violent, wrongrous and masterful, oppression and spoliation, both by himself and others of his causing, sending and hounding out, and he couldn't take o' care the silver when he had gotten it neither, but flung it into yon idle queen's lap at Edinburgh. But light come, light gain. For my part, I never wish to see a kilt in the country again, nor a red coat, nor a gun for that matter, unless it were to shoot a paidrick. They a tarred a stick, and when they have done ye wrang, even when ye are gotten discreet of policy, oppression, and violent profits against them, what better are ye? They ain't no plack to pay ye. Ye need never extract it." With such discourse and the intervening topics of business, the time passed until dinner, Macwheeble meanwhile promising to devise some mode of introducing Edward at the Durtran, where Rose at present resided, without risk of danger or suspicion, which seemed no very easy task, since the lad was a very serious friend to government. The poultry yard had been laid under requisition, and cocky leeky and Scotch collops soon reeked in the Bailey's little parlour. The landlord's corkscrew was just introduced into the muzzle of a pint bottle of claret, cribbed possibly from the cellars of Tullyveoline, when the sight of the grey pony passing the window at full trot induced the Bailey, but with due precaution, to place it aside for the moment. Enter John Scriver with a packet for Mr. Stanley. It is Colonel Talbot's seal, and Edward's fingers tremble as he undoes it. 2 official papers, folded, signed, and sealed, in all formality, drop out. They were hastily picked up by the Bailey, who had a natural respect for everything resembling a deed, and glancing slyly on their titles, his eyes, or rather spectacles, are greeted with "protection by his Royal Highness to the person of Cosmo Comnene Bradwardine, Esquire, of that ilk commonly called Baron of Bradwardine, forfeited for his accession into the late rebellion." The other proves to be a protection of the same tenor in favour of Edward Waverley, Esquire. Colonel Talbot's letter was in these words: "My dear Edward, I am just arrived here, and yet I have finished my business. It had cost me some trouble enough, as you shall hear. I waited upon his Royal Highness immediately on my arrival, and found him in no very good humour for my purpose. 3 or 4 Scotch gentlemen were just leaving his levee. After he had expressed himself to me very courteously, 'Would you think it,' he said, 'Talbot here have been half a dozen of the most respectable gentlemen and best friends to government north of the Forth, Major Melville of Canebeckran, Rubick of Dutron, and others who have fairly wrung from me, by their downright importunity, a present protection and the promise of a future pardon for that stubborn old rebel whom they call Baron of Bradwardine. They allege that his high personal character, and the clemency which he showed to such of our peoples as fell into the rebels' hands, should weigh in his favour, especially as the loss of his estate is likely to be a severe enough punishment. Rubrick has undertaken to keep him at his own house till things are settled in the country, but it's a little hard to be forced in a manner to pardon such a mortal enemy to the House of Brunswick. This was no favourable moment for opening my business. However, I said I was rejoiced to learn that his Royal Highness was in the course of granting such requests, as it emboldened me to present one of the like nature in my own name. He was very angry, but I persisted. I mentioned the uniform support of our 3 votes in the House, touched modestly on services abroad, though valuable only in his Royal Highness's having been pleased kindly to accept them, and founded pretty strongly on his own expressions of friendship and goodwill. He was embarrassed, but having been pleased kindly to accept them, and founded pretty strongly on his own expressions of friendship and goodwill, he was embarrassed but obstinate. I hinted the policy of detaching on all future occasions the heir of such a fortune as your uncle's from the machinations of the disaffected, but I made no impression. I mentioned the obligations which I lay under to Sir Everard and to you personally, and claimed, as the sole reward of my services, that he would be pleased to afford me the means of evincing my gratitude. I perceived that he still meditated a refusal, and taking my commission from my pocket, I said, as a last resource, that as his Royal Highness did not, under these pressing circumstances, think me worthy of a favour which he had not scrupled to grant to the other gentleman, whose services I could hardly judge more important than my own, I must beg leave to deposit, with all humility, my commission in his Royal Highness's hands, and to retire from the service. He was not prepared for this, and told me to take up my commission, said some handsome things of my services, and granted my request. You are therefore once more a free man, and I have promised for you that you will be a good boy in the future, and remember what you owe to the lenity of government. Thus you see my prince can be as generous as yours. I do not pretend, indeed, that he confers a favour with all the foreign graces and compliments of your chevalier errant, but he has a plain English manner, and the evident reluctance with which he grants your request indicates the sacrifice which he makes of his own inclination to your wishes. My friend, the Adjutant General, has procured me a duplicate of the Baron's protection, the original being in Major Melville's possession, which I send to you, as I know that if you can find him, you will have pleasure in being the first to communicate the joyful intelligence. He will, of course, repair to the Dutchman without loss or time, there to ride quarantine for a few weeks. As for you, I give you leave to escort him thither, and to stay a week there, as I understand a certain fair lady is in that quarter, and I have the pleasure to tell you that whatever progress you can make in her good graces will be highly agreeable to Sir Everard and Mrs. Rachel, who will never believe your views and prospects settled, and the three ermines passant in actual safety, until you present them with a Mrs. Edward Waverley. Now certain love affairs of my own, a good many years since, interrupted some measure which were then proposed in favour of the three ermines passant. So I am bound in honour to make them amends. Therefore make good use of your time, for when your week is expired, it will be necessary that you go to London to plead your pardon in the law courts. Ever, dear Waverley, yours most truly, Philip Talbot. End of chapter 66. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England. Section 32 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 60 Years Since, Volume 2 by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 67. Happy's the wooing that's not long a-doing. When the first rapturous sensation occasioned by these excellent tidings had somewhat subsided, Edward proposed instantly to go down to the glen to acquaint the Baron with their import, but the cautious Bailie justly observed that, if the Baron were to appear instantly in public, their tenantry and villagers might become riotous in expressing their joy, and give offence to the powers that be, a sort of persons for whom the Bailie always had unlimited respect. He therefore proposed that Mr. Waverley should go to Janet Gellatley's, and bring the Baron up under cloud of night to Little Veloin, where he might once more enjoy the luxury of a good bed. In the meanwhile, he said he himself would go to Captain Foster, and show him the Baron's protection, and obtain his countenance for harbouring him that night, and he would have horses ready on the morrow to set him on his way to the Dutchman, along with Mr. Stanley. Wilk denomination, I apprehend your honour will for the present retain, said the Bailie. Certainly, Mr. Macwheeble, but will you not go down to the glen yourself in the evening to meet your patron? That I would, with my heart.
and mickle obliged you, your honour, for putting me in mind o' my bounden duty, but it will be past sunset before I get back frae the captain's, and at these unsonsy hours the glen has a bad name. There's something no that canny about old Janet Gellatley. The lad he'll not believe these things, but he was an eye owner rash and venturesome, and feared neither man nor devil, and says seen out. But right sure I am, sir, George McKenny says that no divine can doubt there are witches, since the Bible says thou shalt not suffer them to live, and that no lawyer in Scotland can doubt it, since it is punishable with death by our law. So there's baith law and gospel for it. And his honour winna believe the Leviticus, he might believe the statute book, but he may take his ain way out. It's a dame to Duncan McWeebly. However, I shall send to ask up auld Janet this ain. It's best no to lightly them that have that character, and we'll want Davy to turn the spit, for I'll get Eppie put down a fat goose to the fire for your honours to your supper. When it was near sunset, Waverley hastened to the hut, and he could not but allow that superstition had chosen no improper locality or unfit object for the foundation of her fantastic terrors. It resembled exactly the description of Spenser. There, in a gloomy hollow glen, she found a little cottage built of sticks and reeds, in homely wise and walled with sods around, in which a witch did dwell in loathly weeds, and wilful want or careless of her needs, so choosing solitary to abide, far from all neighbours, that her devilish deeds and hellish arts from people she might hide, and hurt far off, unknown whatsoever she aspired. He entered the cottage with these verses in his memory. Poor old Janet, bent double with age, and blared with peat smoke, was tottering about the hut with a birch broom, muttering to herself as she endeavoured to make her hearth and floor a little clean for the reception of her expected guests. Waverley's step made her start, look up, and fall a-trembling, so much had her nerves been on the rack for her patron's safety. With difficulty, Waverley made her comprehend that the Baron was now safe from personal danger, and when her mind had admitted that joyful news, it was equally hard to make her believe that he was not to enter again upon possession of his estate. "It behoved to be," she said. "He would get it back again. Nobody would as sane gribble as to take his gear after they had given him a pardon, and for that inch grabbit I could whiles wish myself a witch for his sake. I weren't afeard the enemy would take me at my word." Waverley then gave her some money, and promised that her fidelity should be rewarded. "How can I be rewarded, so say weel as just to see my old maister and Miss Rose come back and brook their ain?" Waverley now took leave of Janet, and soon stood beneath the Baron's Patmos. At a low whistle he observed the veteran peeping out to reconnoitre like an old badger with his head out of his hole. "Ye hae come rather early, my good lad," said he, descending. "I question if the redcoats hae beat the tattoo yet, and we're not safe till then." "Good news cannot be told too soon," said Waverley, and with infinite joy communicated to him the happy tidings. The old man stood for a moment in silent devotion, then exclaimed, "Praise be to God, I shall see my bairn again." "And never, I hope, to part with her more," said Waverley. "I trust in God not, unless it be to win the means of supporting her, for my things are but in a bruckle state. But what signifies Wild's gear?" "And if," said Waverley modestly, "there were a situation in life which would put Miss Bradwardine beyond the uncertainty of fortune, and in the rank to which she was born, would you object to it, my dear Baron? Because it would make one of your friends the happiest man in the world." The Baron turned and looked at him with great earnestness. "Yes," continued Edward, "I shall not consider my sentence of banishment as repealed unless you will give me permission to accompany you to the Duchran, and—" The Baron seemed collecting all his dignity to make a suitable reply to what, at another time, he would have treated as the propounding a treaty of alliance between the houses of Bradwardine and Waverley, but his efforts were in vain. The father was too mighty for the Baron. The pride of birth and rank was swept away. In the joyful surprise a slight convulsion passed rapidly over his features, as he gave way to the feelings of nature, threw his arms around Waverley's neck, and sobbed out, "My son, my son, if I had been to search the world, and would have made my choices here." Edward returned the embrace with great sympathy of feeling, and for a little while they both kept silence. At length it was broken by Edward. "But Miss Bradwardine?" "She had never a will but her old father's. Besides, you are a likely youth, of honest principles and high birth. No, she never had any other will than mine, and in my proudest days I could not have wished a more eligible espousal for her than the nephew of my excellent old friend, Sir Everard. But I hope, young man, ye deal nae rashly in this matter. I hope ye have secured the approbation of your ain friends and allies, particularly of your uncle, who is in loco parentis." "Ah, we may take heed o' that." Edward assured him that Sir Everard would think himself highly honoured in the flattering reception his proposal had met with, and that it had his entire approbation, in evidence of which he put Colonel Talbot's letter into the Baron's hand. The Baron read it with great attention. "Sir Everard," he said, "always despised wealth in comparison of honour and birth, and indeed he hath no occasion to court the diva pecunia. Yet I now wish, since this Malcolm turns out such a parricide, for I can call him no better, as to think of alienating Hurley House and the rigs belonging to it. And yet," said he, resuming more cheerfully, "it may be as well as it is, for as Baron of Bradwardine I might have thought it my duty to insist upon certain compliances respecting name and bearings, whilk now, as a landless laird wi' a torchless daughter, no none can blame me for departing from." "Now Heaven be praised," thought Edward, "that Sir Everard does not hear these scruples. The 3 ermines, passant, and rampant beer would certainly have gone together by the ears." He then, with all the ardour of a young lover, assured the Baron that he sought for his happiness only in Rose's heart and hand, and thought himself as happy in her father's simple approbation as if he had settled an earldom upon his daughter. They now reached Little Veolan. The goose was smoking on the table, and the Bailie brandished his knife and fork. A joyous greeting took place between him and his patron. The kitchen, too, had its company. Old Janet was established at the ingle nook. Davy had turned the spit to his immortal honour, and even Ban and Busker, in the liberty of Macwheebly's joy, had been stuffed to the throat with food, and now lay snoring on the floor. The next day conducted the Baron and his young friend to the Duchran, where the former was expected in consequence of the successes of the nearly unanimous application of the Scottish friends of government in his favour.
This had been so general and so powerful that it was almost thought his estate might have been saved, had it not passed into the rapacious hands of his unworthy kinsman, whose right, arising out of the Baron's attainder, could not be affected by a pardon from the crown. The old gentleman, however, said, with his usual spirit, he was more gratified by the hold he possessed in the good opinion of his neighbours than he would have been in being rehabilitated and restored in integrum, had it been found practicable. We shall not attempt to describe the meeting of the father and the daughter, loving each other so affectionately, and separated under such perilous circumstances. Still less shall we attempt to analyse the deep blush of Rose at receiving the compliments of Waverley, or stop to inquire whether she had any curiosity respecting the particular cause of his journey to Scotland at that period. We shall not even trouble the reader with the humdrum details of a courtship 60 years since. It is enough to say that, under so strict a martinet as the Baron, all things were conducted in due form. He took upon himself, the morning after their arrival, the task of announcing the proposal of Waverley to Rose, which she heard with a proper degree of maiden timidity. Fame does, however, say that Waverley had the evening before found 5 minutes to apprise her of what was coming, while the rest of the company were looking at 3 twisted serpents which formed a jet d'eau in the garden. My fair readers will judge for themselves, but for my part I cannot conceive how so important an affair could be communicated in so short a space of time. At least it certainly took a full hour in the Baron's mode of conveying it. Waverley was now considered as a received lover in all the forms. He was made, by dint of smirking and nodding on the part of the lady of the house, to sit next to Miss Bradwardine at dinner, to be Miss Bradwardine's partner at cards. If he came into the room, she of the 4 Mrs. Rubricks who chanced to be next to Rose was sure to recollect that her thimble or her scissors were at the other end of the room, in order to leave the seat nearest to Miss Bradwardine vacant for his occupation. And sometimes, if Papa and Mamma were not in the way to keep them on their good behaviour, the missus would titter a little. The old Laird of Duchran would also have his occasional jest, and the old lady her remark. Even the Baron could not refrain, but here Rose escaped every embarrassment but that of conjecture, for his wit was usually couched in a Latin quotation. The very footmen sometimes grinned too broadly, the maidservants giggled mayhap too loud, and a provoking air of intelligence seemed to pervade the whole family. Alice Bean, the pretty maid of the cavern, who, after her father's misfortune, as she called it, had attended Rose as fille de chambre, smiled and smirked with the best of them. Rose and Edward, however, endured all these little vexatious circumstances as other folks had done before and since, and probably contrived to obtain some indemnification, since they are not supposed, on the whole, to have been particularly unhappy during Waverley's 6 days' stay at the Duchran. It was finally agreed that Edward should go to Waverley-Honour to make the necessary arrangements for his marriage, thence to London to take the proper measures for pleading his pardon, and return as soon as possible to claim the hand of his plighted bride. He also intended in his journey to visit Colonel Talbot, but above all it was his most important object to learn the fate of the unfortunate Chief of Glennaquoich, to witch him at Carlisle, and to try whether anything could be done for procuring, if not a pardon, the communication at least, or alleviation of the punishment to which he was almost certain of being condemned, and in the case of the worst, to offer the miserable Flora an asylum with Rose, or otherwise to assist her views in any mode which might seem possible. The fate of Fergus seemed hard to be averted. Edward had already striven to interest his friend Colonel Talbot in his behalf, but had been given distinctly to understand by his reply that his credit in matters of that nature was totally exhausted. The Colonel was still in Edinburgh, and proposed to wait there for some months upon business confided to him by the Duke of Cumberland. He was to be joined by Lady Emily, to whom easy travelling and Goat's Way were recommended, and who was to journey northward under the escort of Francis Stanley. Edward, therefore, met the Colonel at Edinburgh, who wished him joy in the kindest manner on his approaching happiness, and cheerfully undertook many commissions which our hero was necessarily obliged to delegate to his charge. But on the subject of Fergus he was inexorable. He satisfied Edward, indeed, that his interference would be unavailing, but besides, Colonel Talbot owned that he could not conscientiously use any influence in favour of that unfortunate gentleman. Justice, he said, which demanded some penalty of those who had wrapped the whole nation in fear and mourning, could not perhaps have selected a fitter victim. He came to the field with the fullest light upon the nature of his attempt. He had studied and understood the subject. His father's fate could not intimidate him. The lenity of the laws which had restored to him his father's property and rights could not melt him. That he was brave, generous, and possessed many good qualities only rendered him the more dangerous. That he was enlightened and accomplished made his crime the less inexcusable. That he was an enthusiast in a wrong cause only made him the more fit to be its martyr. Above all, he had been the means of bringing many hundreds of men into the field who without him would never have broken the peace of the country. I repeat it, said the Colonel, though heaven knows with a heart distressed for him as an individual, that this young gentleman has studied and fully understood the desperate game which he has played. He threw for life or death, a coronet or a coffin, and he cannot now be permitted with justice to the country to draw stakes because the dice have gone against him. Such was the reasoning of those times, held even by brave and humane men towards a vanquished enemy. Let us devoutly hope that, in this respect at least, we shall never see the scenes or hold the sentiments that were general in Britain 60 years since. End of chapter 67. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England. Section 33 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since. Volume 2 by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 68. Tomorrow? Oh, that's sudden. Spare him, spare him. Shakespeare. Edward, attended by his former servant, Alec Polwarth, who had re-entered his service at Edinburgh, reached Carlisle while the commission of Oyer and Terminer on his unfortunate associates was yet sitting. He had pushed forward in haste, not, alas, with the most distant hopes of saving Fergus, but to see him for the last time. I ought to have mentioned that he had furnished funds for the defence of the prisoners in the most liberal manner, as soon as he heard that the day of trial was fixed. A solicitor and the first counsel accordingly attended, but it was upon the same footing on which the first physicians are usually summoned to the bedside of some dying man of rank, the doctors to take the advantage of some incalculable chance of an exertion of nature, the lawyers to avail themselves of the barely possible occurrence of some legal flaw. Edward pressed into the court, which was extremely crowded. but by his arriving from the north, and his extreme eagerness and agitation, it was supposed he was a relation of the prisoner's, and people made way for him. It was the third sitting of the court, and there were 2 men at the bar. The verdict of guilty was already pronounced. Edward just glanced at the bar during the momentous pause which ensued. There was no mistaking the stately form and noble features of Fergus MacIvor. Although his dress was squalid and his countenance tinged with the sickly yellow hue of long and close imprisonment, by his side was Evan Maccombich. Edward felt sick and dizzy as he gazed on them, but he was recalled to himself as the clerk of arraigns pronounced the solemn words, "Fergus MacIvor of Glenogwich, otherwise called Vin Ian Vor, and Evan MacIvor in the Dew of Tarasclew, otherwise called Evan Maccombich, or Evan du Maccombich, you, and each of you, stand attainted to high treason. What have you to say for yourselves, why the court should not pronounce judgment against you, that you should die according to the law?" Fergus, as the presiding judge was putting on the fatal cap of judgment, placed his own bonnet upon his head, regarded him with a steadfast and stern look, and replied in a firm tone, "I cannot let this numerous audience suppose that to such an appeal I have no answer to make, but what I have to say you would not bear to hear, for my defence would be your condemnation. Proceed then, in the name of God, to do what is permitted to you. Yesterday and the day before you have condemned loyal and honourable blood to be poured forth like water. Spare not mine. Were that of all my ancestors in my veins, I would have perilled it in this quarrel." He resumed his seat and refused again to rise. Evan Maccombich looked at him with great earnestness, and rising up, seemed anxious to speak, but the confusion of the court, and the perplexity arising from thinking in a language different from that in which he was to express himself, kept him silent. There was a murmur of compassion among the spectators, from the idea that the poor fellow intended to plead the influence of his superior as an excuse for his crime. The judge commanded silence, and encouraged Evan to proceed. "I was only going to say, my lord," said Evan, in what he meant to be an insinuating manner, "that if your excellent honour and the honourable court would let Finch Ian Vohr go free just this once, and let him go back to France, and no to trouble King George's government again, that only 6 of the very best of his clan will be willing to be justified in his stead, and if you'll just let me go down to Glenogwich, I'll fetch them up to ye myself, head to hang, and you may begin with me the very first man." Notwithstanding the solemnity of the occasion, a sort of laugh was heard in the court at the extraordinary nature of the proposal. The judge checked this indecency, and Evan, looking sternly around when the murmur abated, "If the Saxon gentlemen are laughing," he said, "because a poor man such as me thinks my life or the life of 6 of my degree is worth that of rich Ian Vohr, it's like enough they may be very right, but if they laugh because they think I would not keep my word and come back to redeem him, I can tell them they can neither the heart of a Highlandman nor the honour of a gentleman." There was no further inclination to laugh among the audience, and a dead silence ensued. The judge then pronounced upon both prisoners the sentence of the law of high treason, with all its horrible accompaniments. The execution was appointed for the ensuing day. "For you, Fergus MacIvor," continued the judge,
I can hold out no hope of mercy. You must prepare against tomorrow for your last sufferings here, and your great audit hereafter." "I desire nothing else, my lord," answered Fergus in the same manly and firm tone. The hard eyes of Evan, which had been perpetually bent on his chief, were moistened with a tear. "For you, poor ignorant man," continued the judge, "who, following the ideas in which you have been educated, have this day given us a striking example how the loyalty due to the king and state alone is, from your unhappy ideas of clanship, transferred to some ambitious individual who ends by making you the tool of his crimes. For you, I say, I feel so much compassion that, if you can make up your mind to petition for grace, I will endeavour to procure it for you. Otherwise—" "Grace me? No grace," said Evan. "Since you are to shed Vich Ian Vohr's blood, the only favour I would accept from you is to bid them loose my hands and give me my claymore, and bide you just a minute sitting where you are." "Remove the prisoners," said the judge. "His blood will be upon his own head." Almost stupefied with his feelings, Edward found that the rush of the crowd had conveyed him out into the street ere he knew what he was doing. His immediate wish was to see and speak with Fergus once more. He applied at the castle where his unfortunate friend was confined, but was refused admittance. The High Sheriff, a non-commissioned officer said, had requested of the governor that none should be admitted to see the prisoner excepting his confessor and his sister. And where was Miss Mac Ivor? They gave him the direction. It was the house of a respectable Catholic family near Carlisle. Repulsed from the gate of the castle, and not venturing to make application to the High Sheriff or judges in his own unpopular name, he had recourse to the solicitor who came down in Fergus's behalf. This gentleman told him that it was thought the public mind was in danger of being debauched by the account of the last moments of these persons, as given by the friends of the Pretender, that there had been a resolution, therefore, to exclude all such persons as had not the plea or near kindred for attending upon them. Yet he promised, to oblige the heir of Waverley-Honour, to get him an order for admittance to the prisoner the next morning, before his irons were knocked off for execution. "It is of Fergus Mac Ivor they speak thus," thought Waverley, "or do I dream? Of Fergus the bold, the chivalrous, the free-minded, the lofty chieftain of a tribe devoted to him? Is it he that I have seen led the chase and heard the attack, the brave, the active, the young, the noble, the love of ladies, and the theme of song? Is it he who is ironed like a malefactor, who is to be dragged on a hurdle to the common gallows, to die a lingering and cruel death, and to be mangled by the hand of the most outcast of wretches? Evil indeed was the spectre that bodied such a fate as this to the brave chief of Glennaquoich." With a faltering voice he requested the solicitor to find means to warn Fergus of his intended visit, should he obtain permission to make it. He then turned away from him, and returning to the inn, wrote a scarcely intelligible note to Flora Mac Ivor, intimating his purpose to wait upon her that evening. The messenger brought back a letter in Flora's beautiful Italian hand, which seemed scarce to tremble even under this load of misery. Miss Flora Mac Ivor, the letter bore, could not refuse to see the dearest friend of her dear brother, even in her present circumstances of unparalleled distress. When Edward reached Miss Mac Ivor's present place of abode, he was instantly admitted. In a large and gloomy tapestried apartment, Flora was seated by a latticed window, sewing what seemed to be a garment of white flannel.
At a little distance sat an elderly woman, apparently a foreigner, and of religious order. She was reading in a book of Catholic devotion, but when Waverley entered, laid it on the table and left the room. Flora rose to receive him and stretched out her hand, but neither ventured to attempt speech. Her fine complexion was totally gone, her person considerably emaciated, and her face and hands as white as the purest statuary marble, forming a strong contrast with her sable dress and jet black hair. Yet amid these marks of distress there was nothing negligent or ill-arranged about her attire. Even her hair, though totally without ornament, was disposed with her usual attention to neatness. The first words she uttered were, "Have you seen him?" "Alas, no," answered Waverley. "I have been refused admittance." "It accords with the rest," she said, "but we must submit. Shall you obtain leave, do you suppose?" "For tomorrow," said Waverley, but muttering the last word so faintly that it was almost unintelligible. "Ay, then or never," said Flora, "until," she added, looking upward, "the time when I trust we shall all meet. But I hope you will see him while earth yet bears him. He always loved you at his heart, though, but it is in vain to talk of the past." "Vain, indeed," echoed Waverley. "Or even the future, my good friend," said Flora, "so far as earthly events are concerned. For how often have I pictured to myself the strong possibility of this horrid issue, and tasked myself to consider how I could support my part, and yet how far has all my anticipation fallen short of the unimaginable bitterness of this hour. Dear Flora, your strength of mind—" "Ay, there it is," she answered somewhat wildly. "There is, Mr. Waverley, there is a bushy devil at my heart that whispers but it were madness to listen to it, that the strength of mind on which Flora prided herself has murdered her brother." "Good God, how can you give utterance to a thought so shocking?" "Ay, it is not so, but yet it haunts me like a phantom. I know it is unsubstantial and vain, but it will be present. It will intrude its horrors on my mind, will whisper that my brother, as volatile as ardent, would have divided his energies amid 100 objects. It was I who taught him to concentrate them, and to gauge all on this dreadful and desperate cast. Oh, that I could recollect that I had but once said to him, 'He that striketh with the sword shall die by the sword;' that I had but once said, 'Remain at home, reserve yourself, your vassals, your life, for enterprises within the reach of man.' But oh, Mr. Waverley, I spurred his fiery temper, and half of his ruin at least lies with his sister." The horrid idea which she had intimated, Edward endeavoured to combat by every incoherent argument that occurred to him. He recalled to her the principles on which both thought it their duty to act, and in which they had been educated. "Do not think I have forgotten them," she said, looking up with eager quickness. "I do not regret his attempt because it was wrong. Oh no, on that point I am armed, but because it was impossible it could end otherwise than thus. Yet it did not always seem so desperate and hazardous as it was, and it would have been chosen by the bold spirit of Fergus, whether you had approved it or no. Your counsels only served to give unity and consistence to his conduct, to dignify but not to precipitate his resolution." Flora had soon ceased to listen to Edward, and was again intended upon her needlework. "Do you remember," she said, looking up with a ghastly smile, "once you found me making Fergus's bride favours, and now I am sewing his bridal garment. Our friends here," she continued, with suppressed emotion, "are to give hallowed earth in their chapel to the bloody relics of the last Vich Ian Vohr, but they will not all rest together. No, his head. I shall not have the last miserable consolation of kissing the cold lips of my dear, dear Fergus." The unfortunate Flora here, after one or two hysterical sobs, fainted in her chair. The lady who had been attending in the ante-room now entered hastily, and begged Edward to leave the room, but not the house. When he was recalled, after the space of nearly half an hour, he found that, by a strong effort, Miss Mac Ivor had greatly composed herself. It was then he ventured to urge Miss Bradwardine's claim to be considered as an adopted sister, and empowered to assist her plans for the future. "I have had a letter from my dear Rose," she replied, "to the same purpose. Sorrow is selfish and engrossing, or I would have written to express that, even in my own despair, I felt a gleam of pleasure at learning her happy prospects, and at hearing that the good old Baron has escaped the general wreck. Give this to my dearest Rose. It is her poor Flora's only ornament of value, and was the gift of a princess." She put into his hands a case containing the chain of diamonds with which she used to decorate her hair. "To me it is in future useless. The kindness of my friends has secured me a retreat into the convent of the Scottish Benedictine nuns in Paris. To-morrow, if indeed I can survive to-morrow, I set forward on my journey with this venerable sister. And now, Mr. Waverley, adieu. May you be as happy with Rose as your amiable dispositions deserve, and think sometimes on the friends you have lost. Do not attempt to see me again. It would be mistaken kindness." She gave him her hand, on which Edward shed a torrent of tears, and with a faltering step withdrew from the apartment, and returned to the town of Carlisle. At the inn he found a letter from his law friend, intimating that he would be admitted to Fergus next morning as soon as the castle gates were opened, and permitted to remain with him till the arrival of the sheriff gave signal for the fatal procession. End of chapter 68. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England.
Section 34 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since, Volume 2, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 69. A darker departure is near, the death drum is muffled, and sable the bier. Campbell. After a sleepless night, the first dawn of morning found Waverley on the esplanade in front of the old Gothic gates of Carlisle Castle. But he paced it long in every direction before the hour when, according to the rules of the garrison, the gates were opened and the drawbridge lowered. He produced his order to the sergeant of the guard and was admitted. The place of Fergus's confinement was a gloomy and vaulted apartment in the central part of the castle, a huge old tower, supposed to be of great antiquity, and surrounded by outworks, seemingly of Henry VIII's time, or somewhat later. The grating of the large old-fashioned bars and bolts, withdrawn for the purpose of admitting Edward, was answered by the clash of chains, as the unfortunate chieftain, strongly and heavily fettered, shuffled along the stone floor of his prison to fling himself into his friend's arms. "My dear Edward," he said, in a firm and even cheerful voice, "this is truly kind. I hear of your approaching happiness with the highest pleasure. And how does Rose? And how is our old whimsical friend, the Baron? Well, I trust, since I see you at freedom. And how will you settle precedence between the three ermines passant, and the bear and boot-jack? How, oh how, my dear Fergus, can you talk of such things at such a moment? Why, we have entered Carlisle with happier auspices, to be sure, on the 16th of November last, for example, when we marched in side by side, and hoisted the white flag on these ancient towers. But I am no boy to sit down and weep because the luck has gone against me. I knew the stake which I risked. We played the game boldly, and the forfeit shall be paid manfully. And now, since my time is short, let me come to the questions that interest me most. "The prince. Has he escaped the bloodhounds?" "He has, and is in safety." "Praised be God for that. Tell me the particulars of his escape." Waverley communicated that remarkable history, so far as it had then transpired, to which Fergus listened with deep interest. He then asked after several other friends, and made many minute inquiries concerning the fate of his own clansmen. They had suffered less than other tribes who had been engaged in the affair, for having in a great measure dispersed and returned home after the captivity of their chieftain, according to the universal custom of the Highlanders, they were not in arms when the insurrection was finally suppressed, and consequently were treated with less rigor. This Fergus heard with great satisfaction. "You are rich," he said, "Waverley, and you are generous. When you hear of these poor MacIvors being distressed about their miserable possessions by some harsh overseer or agent of government, remember you have worn their tartan, and are an adopted son of their race. The Baron, who knows our manners and lives near our country, will apprise you of the time and means to be their protector. Will you promise this to the LXVIII war?" Edward, as may well be believed, pledged his word, which he afterwards so amply redeemed that his memory still lives in these glens by the name of the friend of the sons of Ivor. "Would to God," continued the chieftain, "I could bequeath to you my rights, to the love and obedience of this primitive and brave race, or at least, as I have striven to do, persuade poor Evan to accept of his life upon their terms, and be to you what he has been to me, the kindest, the bravest, the most devoted." The tears which his own fate could not draw forth fell fast for that of his foster brother. "But," said he, drying them, "that cannot be. You cannot be to them Vicky and Vor." And these three magic words, said he, half smiling, are the only open sesame to their feelings and sympathies. And poor Evan must attend his foster brother in death, as he has done through his whole life. "And I am sure," said Maccombich, raising himself from the floor, on which, for fear of interrupting their conversation, he had lain so still, that in the obscurity of the apartment Edward was not aware of his presence, "I am sure Evan never desired or deserved a better end than just to die with his chieftain." "And now," said Fergus, "while we are upon the subject of clanship, what think you now of the prediction of the Bodach Glas?" Then, before Edward could answer, "I saw him again last night. He stood in the slip of moonshine which fell from that high and narrow window toward my bed. Why should I fear him? I thought, tomorrow, long ere this time, I shall be as immaterial as he. False spirit, I said, art thou come to close thy walks on earth, and to enjoy thy triumph in the fall of the last descendant of thine enemy? The spectre seemed to beckon and to smile as he faded from my sight. What do you think of it? I asked the same question of the priest, who was a good and sensible man. He admitted that the church allowed that such apparitions were possible, but urged me not to permit my mind to dwell upon it, as imagination plays us such strange tricks. What do you think of it?" "Much as your confessor," said Waverley, "willing to avoid dispute upon such a point at such a moment." A tap at the door now announced that good man, and Edward retired while he administered to both prisoners the last rites of religion, and the mode which the Church of Rome prescribes. In about an hour he was readmitted. Soon after, a file of soldiers entered with a blacksmith, who struck the fetters from the legs of the prisoners. "You see the compliment they pay to our Highland strength and courage. We have lain chained here like wild beasts, till our legs are cramped into palsy, and when they free us, they send 6 soldiers with loaded muskets to prevent our taking the castle by storm." Edward afterwards learned that these severe precautions had been taken in consequence of a desperate attempt of the prisoners to escape, in which they had very nearly succeeded. Shortly afterwards, the drums of the garrison beat to arms. "This is the last turnout," said Fergus, "that I shall hear and obey. And now, my dear, dear Edward, ere we part let us speak of Flora, a subject which awakes the tenderest feeling that yet thrills within me." "We part not here," said Waverley. "Oh, yes, we do. You must come no farther. Not that I fear what is to follow for myself," he said proudly. "Nature has her tortures as well as art. And how happy should we think the man who escapes from the throes of a mortal and painful disorder in the space of a short half-hour. And this matter, spin it out as they will, cannot last longer. But what a dying man can suffer firmly may kill a living friend to look upon. This same law of high treason," he continued, with astonishing firmness and composure. "Is one of the blessings, Edward, with which your free country has accommodated poor old Scotland. Her own jurisprudence, as I have heard, was much milder. But I suppose one day or other, when there are no longer any wild Highlanders to benefit by its tender mercies, they will blot it from their records as levelling them with a nation of cannibals. The mummery, too, of exposing the senseless head, they have not the wit to grace mine with a paper coronet. There would be some satire in that, Edward. I hope they will set it on the Scotch gate, though, that I may look even after death to the blue hills of my own country, which I love so dearly." The Baron would have added, "Moritur, et moriens duces reminiscitur Argos." A bustle and the sound of wheels and horses' feet was now heard in the courtyard of the castle. "As I have told you why you must not follow me, and these sounds admonish me that my time flies fast, tell me how you found poor Flora." Waverley, with a voice interrupted by suffocating sensations, gave some account of the state of her mind. "Poor Flora," answered the chief. "She could have borne her own sentence of death, but not mine. You, Waverley, will soon know the happiness of mutual affection in the married state. Long, long may Rose and you enjoy it. But you can never know the purity of feeling which combines two orphans like Flora and me, left alone, as it were, in the world, and being all in all to each other from our very infancy. But her strong sense of duty and predominant feeling of loyalty will give new nerve to her mind after the immediate and acute sensation of this parting has passed away. She will then think of Fergus as of the heroes of our race, upon whose deeds she loved to dwell." "Shall she not see you, then?" asked Waverley. She seemed to expect it. "A necessary deceit will spare her the last dreadful parting. I cannot part with her without tears, and I cannot bear that these men should think they have power to extort them. She was made to believe she would see me at an hour later, and this letter, which my confessor will deliver, will apprise her that all is over." An officer now appeared and intimated that the High Sheriff and his attendants waited before the gate of the castle to claim the bodies of Fergus MacIvor and Evan Maccombich. "I come," said Fergus. Accordingly, supporting Edward by the arm and followed by Evan Dhu and the priest, he moved down the stairs of the tower, the soldiers bringing up the rear. The court was occupied by a squadron of dragoons and a battalion of infantry drawn up in Hollow Square. Within their ranks was the sledge or hurdle on which the prisoners were to be drawn to the place of execution, about a mile distant from Carlisle. It was painted black and drawn by a white horse. At one end of the vehicle sat the executioner, a horrid-looking fellow, as beseemed his trade, with a broad axe in his hand. At the other end, next the horse, was an empty seat for two persons. Through the deep and dark Gothic archway that opened on the drawbridge were seen on horseback the High Sheriff and his attendants, whom the etiquette betwixt the civil and military powers did not permit to come farther. "This is well got up for a closing scene," said Fergus, smiling disdainfully as he gazed around upon the apparatus of terror. Evan Dhu exclaimed with some eagerness, after looking at the dragoons, "These are the very shields that galloped off at Gladsmuir, before we could kill a dozen of them. They look bold enough now, however." The priest entreated him to be silent. The sledge now approached, and Fergus, turning round, embraced Waverley, kissed him on each side of the face, and stepped nimbly into his place. Evan sat down by his side. The priest was to follow in a carriage belonging to his patron, the Catholic gentleman, at whose house Flora resided. As Fergus waved his hand to Edward, the ranks closed around the sledge, and the whole procession began to move forward. There was a momentary stop at the gateway, while the governor of the castle and the High Sheriff went through a short ceremony, the military officer there delivering over the persons of criminals to the civil power. "God save King George," said the High Sheriff. When the formality concluded, Fergus stood erect in the sledge, and with a firm and steady voice replied, "God save King James." These were the last words which Waverley heard him speak. The procession resumed its march, and the sled vanished from beneath the portal, under which it had stopped for an instant. The Dead March was then heard, and its melancholy sounds were mingled with those of a muffled peal tolled from the neighbouring cathedral. The sound of military music died away as the procession moved on. The sullen clang of bells was soon heard to sound alone. The last of the soldiers had now disappeared from under the vaulted archway, through which they had been filing for several minutes. The courtyard was now totally empty, but Waverley still stood there as if stupefied, his eyes fixed upon the dark pass where he had so lately seen the last glimpse of his friend. At length the female servant of the governor's, struck with compassion at the stupefied misery which his countenance expressed, asked him if he would not walk into her master's house and sit down. She was obliged to repeat her question twice ere he comprehended her, but at length it recalled him to himself. Declining the courtesy by a hasty gesture, he pulled his hat over his eyes, and leaving the castle, walked as swiftly as he could through the empty streets, till he regained his inn, then rushed into an apartment, and bolted the door. In about an hour and a half, which seemed an age of unutterable suspense, the sound of the drums and fifes, performing a lively air, and the confused murmur of the crowd which now filled the streets, so lately deserted, apprised him that all was finished, and that the military and populace were returning from the dreadful scene. I will not attempt to describe his sensations. In the evening the priest made him a visit, and informed him that he did so by directions of his deceased friend, to assure him that Fergus MacIvor had died as he lived, and remembers his friendship to the last. He added, he had also seen Flora, whose state of mind seemed more composed since all was over. With her and Sister Teresa, the priest proposed next day to leave Carlisle for the nearest seaport, from which they could embark for France. Waverley forced on this good man a ring of some value, and a sum of money to be employed, as he thought might gratify Flora, in the services of the Catholic Church, for the memory of his friend. Fungarque inani munier, he repeated, as the ecclesiastic retired. Yet why not class these acts of remembrance with other honours, with which affection in all sects pursues the memory of the dead? The next morning ere daylight he took leave of the town of Carlisle, promising to himself never again to enter its walls. He dared hardly look back toward the Gothic battlements of the fortified gate under which he passed, for the place is surrounded with an old wall. There, no there, said Alec Polwarth, who guessed the cause of the dubious look which Waverley cast backward, and who, with the vulgar appetite for the horrible, was the master of each detail of the butchery. The eds were ower to the Scotch yate, as they can it. It's a great pity of Evan Dhu, who was a very weel-meaning and good-natured man, to be a Highland man. And indeed so was the Laird of Glennaquoich too, for that matter, when he was na an ane o' his Tiraves. End of chapter 69. Section 35 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since, Volume 2, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 70. Dulce Domum. The impression of horror with which Waverley left Carlisle softened by degrees into melancholy, a gradation which was accelerated by the painful yet soothing task of writing to Rose, and while he could not suppress his own feelings of the calamity, he endeavoured to place it in a light which might grieve her without shocking her imagination. The picture which he drew for her benefit he gradually familiarized to his own mind, and his next letters were more cheerful, and referred to the prospects of peace and happiness which lay before them. Yet though his first horrible sensations had sunk into melancholy, Edward had reached his native country before he could, as usual on former occasions, look round for enjoyment upon the face of nature. He then, for the first time since leaving Edinburgh, began to experience what pleasure, which almost all feel who return to a verdant, populous, and highly cultivated country, from scenes of waste desolation, or of solitary and melancholy grandeur. But how were those feelings enhanced when he entered on the domain so long possessed by his forefathers, recognized the old oaks of Waverley Chase, thought with what delight he should introduce Rose to all his favourite haunts, beheld at length the towers of the venerable hall arise above the woods which embowered it, and finally threw himself into the arms of the venerable relations to whom he owed so much duty and affection. The happiness of their meeting was not tarnished by a single word of reproach. On the contrary, whatever pain Sir Everard and Mrs. Rachel had felt during Waverley's perilous engagement with the young Chevalier, it assorted too well with the principles in which they had been brought up to incur reprobation or even censure. Colonel Talbot also had smoothed the way with great address for Edward's favourable reception by dwelling upon his gallant behaviour in the military character, particularly his bravery and generosity at Preston, until warmed at the idea of their nephew's engaging in single combat, making prisoner, and saving from slaughter so distinguished an officer as the colonel himself, the imagination of the baronet and his sister ranked the exploits of Edward with those of Wilibert, Hildebrand, and Nigel, the vaunted heroes of their line. The appearance of Waverley, embrowned by exercise and dignified by the habits of military discipline, had acquired an athletic and hardy character, which not only verified the colonel's narration, but surprised and delighted all the inhabitants of Waverley-Honour. They crowded to see, to hear him, and to sing his praises. Mr. Pembroke, who secretly extolled his spirit and courage in embracing the genuine cause of the Church of England, censured his pupil gently, nevertheless, for being so careless of his manuscripts, which indeed, he said, had occasioned him some personal inconvenience, as upon the baronet's being arrested by a king's messenger, he had deemed it prudent to retire to a concealment called the priest's hole, from the use it had been put to in former days, where, he assured our hero, the butler had thought it safe to venture with food only once in the day, so that he had been repeatedly compelled to dine upon victuals, either absolutely cold, or what was worse, only half warm, not to mention that sometimes his bed had not been arranged for 2 days together. Waverley's mind involuntarily turned to the Patmos of the Baron of Bradwardine, who was well pleased with Janet's fare, and a few bunches of straw stowed in a cleft in the front of a sand-cliff, but he made no remarks upon a contrast which could only mortify his worthy tutor. All was now in a bustle to prepare for the nuptials of Edward, an event to which the good old baronet and Mrs. Rachel looked forward as if to the renewal of their own youth. The match, as Colonel Talbot had intimated, had seemed to them in the highest degree eligible, having every recommendation but wealth, of which they themselves had more than enough. Mr. Clippurse was therefore summoned to Waverley-Honour, under better auspices than at the commencement of our story. But Mr. Clippurse came not alone, for being now stricken in years, he had associated with him a nephew, a younger vulture, as our English Juvenal, who tells the tale of Swallow the attorney, might have called him. And they now carried on business as Messrs. Clippurse and Hookham. These worthy gentlemen had directions to make the necessary settlements on the most splendid scale of liberality, as if Edward were to wed the peeress in her own right, with her paternal estate tacked to the fringe of her ermine. But before entering upon a subject of proverbial delay, I must remind my reader of the progress of a stone rolled downhill by an idle truant boy, a pastime at which I was myself expert in my more juvenile years. It moves at first slowly, avoiding by inflection every obstacle of the least importance, but when it has attained its full impulse and draws near the conclusion of its career, it smokes and thunders down, taking a rood at every spring, clearing hedge and ditch like a Yorkshire huntsman, and becoming most furiously rapid in its course when it is nearest to being consigned to rest forever. Even such is the course of a narrative like that which you are perusing. The earlier events are studiously dwelt upon, that you, kind reader, may be introduced to the character rather by narrative than by the duller medium of direct description. But when the story draws near its close, we hurry over the circumstances, however important, which your imagination must have forestalled, and leave you to suppose those things which it would be abusing your patience to relate at length. We are, therefore, so far from attempting to trace the dull progress of Messrs. Clippurse and Hookham, or that of their worthy official brethren, who had the charge of suing out the pardons of Edward Waverley and his intended father-in-law, that we can but touch upon matters more attractive. The mutual epistles, for example, which were exchanged between Sir Everard and the Baron upon this occasion, though matchless specimens of eloquence in their way, must be consigned to merciless oblivion. Nor can I tell you at length how worthy Aunt Rachel, not without a delicate and affectionate allusion to the circumstances which had transferred Rose's maternal diamonds to the hands of Donalbain Lane, stocked her casket with a set of jewels that a duchess might have envied. Moreover, the reader will have the goodness to imagine that Job Houghton and his dame were suitably provided for, although they could never be persuaded that their son fell otherwise than fighting by the young squire's side. So that Alick, who as a lover of truth had made many needless attempts to expound the real circumstances to them, was finally ordered to say not a word more upon the subject. He indemnified himself, however, by the liberal allowance of desperate battles, grisly executions, and raw head and bloody bone stories with which he astonished the servants' hall. But although these important matters may be briefly told in narrative, like a newspaper report of a chancery suit, yet with all the urgency which Waverley could use, the real time which the law proceedings occupied, joined to the delay occasioned by the mode of travelling at that period, rendered it considerably more than 2 months ere Waverley, having left England, alighted once more at the mansion of the Laird of Duchran to claim the hand of his plighted bride. The day of his marriage was fixed for the 6th after his arrival. The Baron of Bradwardine, with whom bridals, christenings, and funerals were festivals of high and solemn import, felt a little hurt that, including the family of the Duchran and all the immediate vicinity who had title to be present on such an occasion, there could not be above 30 persons collected. When he was married, he observed, 300 horse of gentlemen born, besides servants and some score or two of Highland lairds, who never got on horseback, were present on the occasion. But his pride found some consolation in reflecting that he and his son-in-law, having been so lately in arms against government, it might give matter of reasonable fear and offence to the ruling powers if they were to collect together the kith, kin, and allies of their houses, arrayed in a fear of war, as was the ancient custom of Scotland on these occasions, and without dubitation, he concluded with a sigh, many of those who would have rejoiced most freely upon these joyful espousals are either gone to a better place or are now exiles from their native land. The marriage took place on the appointed day. The Reverend Mr. Rubrick, kinsman to the proprietor of the hospitable mansion where it was solemnized, and chaplain to the Baron of Bradwardine, had the satisfaction to unite their hands, and Frank Stanley acted as bridesman, having joined Edward with that view soon after his arrival. Lady Emily and Colonel Talbot had proposed being present, but Lady Emily's health, when the day approached, was found inadequate to the journey. In amends, it was arranged that Edward Waverley and his lady, who, with the Baron, proposed an immediate journey to Waverley-Honour, should in their way spend a few days at an estate which Colonel Talbot had been tempted to purchase in Scotland as a very great bargain, and at which he proposed to reside for some time. End of chapter 70.
Section 36 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since, Volume 2 by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 71. This is no mine house, I ken by the biggin out. Old Song. The nuptial party travelled in great style. There was a coach and six after the newest pattern, which Sir Everard had presented to his nephew, that dazzled with its splendour the eyes of one half of Scotland. There was the family coach of Mr. Rubrick. Both these were crowned with ladies, and there were gentlemen on horseback, with their servants, to the number of a round score. Nevertheless, without having the fear of famine before his eyes, Bailie Macwheeble met them in the road to entreat that they would pass by his house at Little Veloin. The Baron stared, and said his son and he would certainly ride by Little Veloin, and pay their compliments to the Bailie, but could not think of bringing with them the Hail Comitus nuptials or matrimonial procession. He added that as he understood that the barony had been sold by its unworthy possessor, he was glad to see his old friend Duncan had regained his situation under the new dominus, or proprietor. The Bailie ducked, bowed, and fidgeted, and then again insisted upon his invitation, until the Baron, though rather piqued at the pertinency of his instance, could not nevertheless refuse to consent without making evident sensations which he was anxious to conceal. He fell into a deep study as they approached the top of the avenue, and was only startled from it by observing that the battlements were replaced, the ruins cleared away, and, most wonderful of all, that the two great stone bears, those mutilated dragoons of his idolatry had resumed their post over the gateway. "Now this new proprietor," said he to Edward, "has shown more gusto, as the Italians call it, in the short time he has had this domain than the hound Malcolm, though I bred him here myself, has acquired vita aduc durante. And now I talk of hounds, it's not yon Baron Busker who comes scooping up the avenue with Davy Gellatley." "I vote we should go to meet them, sir," said Waverley, "for I believe the present master of the house is Colonel Talbot, who will expect to see us. We hesitated to mention to you at first that he had purchased your ancient patrimonial property, and even yet, if you do not incline to visit him, we can pass on to the Baileys." The Baron had occasion for all his magnanimity. However, he drew a long breath, took a long snuff, and observed, since they had brought him so far, he could not pass the Colonel's gate, and he would be happy to see the new master of his old tenants. He alighted accordingly, as did the other gentlemen and ladies. He gave his arm to his daughter, and as they descended the avenue, pointed out to her how speedily the Diva Puccinia of the Sovereign, the tutelary deity he might call her, had removed the marks of spoliation. In truth, not only had the felled trees been removed, but their stumps being grubbed up and the earth round them levelled and sown with grass, every mark of devastation, unless to an eye intimately acquainted with the spot, was already totally obliterated. There was a similar reformation in the outward man of Davy Gellatley, who met them every now and then, stopping to admire the new suit which graced his person, in the same colours as formerly, but bedizened, fine enough to have served Touchstone himself. He danced up with his usual ungainly frolics, first to the Baron and then to Rose, passing his hands over his clothes, crying, "Bra, bra, Davy!" and Sacre able to sing a bar to an end of his 1,001 songs for the breathless extravagance of his joy. The dogs also acknowledged their old master with 1,000 gambols. "Upon my conscience, Rose," ejaculated the Baron, "the gratitude o' they dumb brutes and of that pure innocent brings the tears into my auld een, while that skillum Malcolm, but I'm obliged to Colonel Talbot for putting my hounds into such good condition, and likewise for poor Davy. But Rose, my dear, we must not permit them to be a life-rent burden upon the estate." As he spoke, Lady Emily, leaning upon the arm of her husband, met the party at the lower gate with 1,000 welcomes. After the ceremony of introduction had been gone through, much abridged by the ease and excellent breeding of Lady Emily, she apologized for having used a little art to wile them back to a place which might awaken some painful reflections. But as it was to change masters, we were very desirous that the Baron— "Mr. Bradwardine, madam, if you please," said the old gentleman. "Mr. Bradwardine, then, and Mr. Waverley should see what we have done towards restoring the mansion of your fathers to its former state." The Baron answered with a low bow. Indeed, when he entered the court, excepting that the heavy stables which had been burnt down were replaced by buildings of a lighter and more picturesque appearance, all seemed as much as possible restored to the state in which he had left it when he had assumed arms some months before. The pigeon house was replenished, the fountain played with its usual activity, and not only the bear who predominated over its basin, but all the other bears whatsoever were replaced on their several stations, and renewed or repaired with so much care that they bore no tokens of the violence which had so lately descended upon them. While these minutiae had been so needfully attended to, it is scarce necessary to add that the house itself had been thoroughly repaired, as well as the gardens, with the strictest attention to maintain the original character of both, and to remove as far as possible all appearance of the ravage they had sustained. The Baron gazed in silent wonder. At length he addressed Colonel Talbot. "While I acknowledge my obligation to you, sir, for the restoration of the badge of our family, I cannot but marvel that you have nowhere established your own crest, whilk is, I believe, a mastiff, anciently called a Talbot, as the poet has it. A Talbot strong, a sturdy tyke. At least such a dog is the crest of the martial and renowned Earl of Shrewsbury, to whom your family are probably blood relations." "I believe," said the Colonel, smiling, "our dogs are whelps of the same litter. For my part, if crests were to dispute precedence, I should be apt to let them, as the proverbs say, fight dogs, fight bear." As he made this speech, at which the Baron took another long pinch of snuff, they had entered the house, that is, the Baron, Rose, and Lady Emily, with young Stanley and the Bailie, for Edward and the rest of the party remained on the terrace to examine a new greenhouse stocked with the finest plants. The Baron resumed his favourite topic. "However it may please you to derogate from the honour of your baronet, Colonel Talbot, which is doubtless your humour, as I have seen in other gentlemen of my birth and honour in your country, I must again repeat it as a most ancient and distinguished bearing, as well as that of my young friend Francis Stanley, which is the eagle and child." "The bird and bantling they call it in Derbyshire, sir," said Stanley. "Ye're a daft callant, sir," said the Baron, who had a great liking to this young man, perhaps because he sometimes teased him. "Ye're a daft callant, and I must correct you some of these days," shaking his great brown fist at him. "But what I mean to say, Colonel Talbot, is that yours is an ancient prosmere or descent, and since you have lawfully and justly acquired the estate for you and yours, which I have lost for me and mine, I wish it may remain in your name as many centuries as it has done in that of the late proprietors." "That," answered the Colonel, "is very handsome, Mr. Bradwardine, indeed. And yet, sir, I cannot but marvel that you, Colonel, whom I noted to have so much of the armour praetorius when we met in Edinburgh as to vilipend other countries, should have chosen to establish your lairs, or household gods, peculiar practice finibus, and in a manner to expatriate yourself." "Why, really, Baron, I do not see why, to keep the secret of these foolish boys, Waverley and Stanley, and of my wife, who is no wiser, one old soldier should continue to impose upon another. You must know, then, that I have so much of that same prejudice in favour of my native country, that the sum of money which I advanced to the seller of this extensive barony has only purchased for me a box in shire called Brayward Lodge, with about 250 acres of land, the chief merit of which is, that it is within a very few miles of Waverley-Honour." "And who, then, in the name of heaven, has bought this property?" "That," said the Colonel, "it is this gentleman's profession to explain." The Bailie, whom this reference regarded, and who had all this while shifted from one foot to another with great impatience, "like a hen," as he afterwards said, "upon a cate girdle," and chuckling, he might have added, "like the said hen in all the glory of laying an egg," now pushed forward. That I can, your honour," drawing from his pocket a budget of papers, and untying the red tape with a hand trembling with eagerness. "Here is the disposition and assignation by Malcolm Bradwardine of Inchbrabbit, regularly signed and tested in terms of the statute, whereby for a certain sum of sterling money presently contented and paid to him, he has dispossessed, alienated, and conveyed the whole estate and barony of Bradwardine, Tully Veolan, and others with the fortalice and manor place." "For God's sake, to the point, sir, I have all that by heart," said the Colonel.
to Cosmo Comwine Bradwardine, Esquire," pursued the Bailie, "his heirs and assignees simply the irredeemably to be held either a mere vel de me." "Pray read short, sir." "On the conscience of an honest man, Colonel, I read as short as it is consistent with style, under the burden and reservation always—" "Mr. Macwheeble, this would outlast a Russian winter. Give me leave in short, Mr. Bradwardine. Your family estate is your own once more, in full property, and at your absolute disposal, but only burdened with the sum advanced to repurchase it, which I understand is utterly disproportioned to its value." "An old sang, if it please your honours," cried the Bailie, rubbing his hands. "Look at the rental book." "Which sum being advanced by Mr. Edward Waverley, chiefly from the price of his father's property which I bought from him, is secured to his lady your daughter and her family by this marriage." "It is a Catholic security," shouted the Bailie, "to Rose Comwine Bradwardine, ally Waverley, in life rent, and the children of the said marriage in fee, and I made up a wee bit minute of an antenuptial contract, initiu matrimoniae, so it cannot be subject to reduction hereafter, as a donation inter virum aurixum." It is difficult to say whether the worthy Baron was most delighted with the restitution of his family property, or with the delicacy and generosity that left him unfettered to pursue his purpose in disposing of it after his death, and which avoided as much as possible even the appearance of laying him under pecuniary obligation. When his first pause and joy of astonishment was over, his thoughts turned to the unworthy heir male, who he pronounced had sold his birthright like a sou for a mess o' pottage. "But wha cook it, the partridge, for him?" exclaimed the Bailie. "I would like to ken that." "Wha but your honour's to command, Duncan Macwheeble? His honour, young Mr. Waverley, put it in to my hand frae the beginning, frae the first calling o' the summons, as I may say. I circumvented them, I played at bogle about the bush with them, I cajoled them, and if I han given inch grabbit and Amy Jowie a bonny begunk, they ken themselves him a writer. I int gas blandash to them wi' our young bridegroom, or gar 'em to board up the market. Na, I scarce them wi' our wild tenantry, and the MacIvors that are but still settled yet, till they durstn't on ony road whatsoever gang o'er the doorstane after gloaming, for fear John Heatherbutler, or some siccan dare the deil, should take a bath at them. Then, on the other hand, I beflumed them wi' Colonel Talbot, but they offered to keep up the price again. The Duke's friend, did they na ken wha was master? They had na seen enough, but the sad example of mony a pure misguided and happy body." "Who went to Derby, for example, Mr. Macwheeble?" said the Colonel to him aside. "Oh, whisht, Colonel, for the love o' God, let that flea stick either where. There were mony good folk at Derby, and it's ill speaking of halters," with a sly cast of his eye toward the Baron, who was in deep reverie. Starting out of it at once, he took Macwheeble by the button and led him into one of the deep window recesses, whence only fragments of their conversation reached the rest of the party. It certainly related to stamp paper and parchment, for no other subject, even from the mouth of his patron, and he once more an efficient one, could have arrested so deeply the Bailie's reverent and absorbed attention. "I understand your honour perfectly. It can be done as taken out a decree in absence, to her and him after my demise, and to her heirs male, but preferring the second son, if God shall bless them with two, who is to carry the name and arms of Bradwardine of that ilk, without any other name
or immoral bearings whatsoever. "Tut, your honour," whispered the Bailie, "I'll mak a slight jaunting in the morn. It will cost but a quarter of resignation in forum, and I'll have it ready for the next term in Exchequer." Their private conversation ended, the Baron was now summoned to do the honours of Tullyveoline to new guests. These were Major Melville of Cairnvreckan and the Reverend Mr. Morton, followed by 2 or 3 others of the Baron's acquaintances, who had been made privy to his having again acquired the estate of his fathers. The shouts of the villagers were also heard beneath in the courtyard, for Saunderson, who had kept the secret for several days with laudable prudence, had unloosened his tongue upon beholding the arrival of the carriages. But while Edward received Major Melville with politeness and the clergyman with the most affectionate and grateful kindness, his father-in-law looked a little awkward, as uncertain how he should answer the necessary claims of hospitality to his guests, and forward the festivity of his tenants. Lady Emily relieved him by intimating that, though she must be an indifferent representative of Mrs. Edward Waverley in many respects, she hoped the Baron would approve of the entertainment she had ordered in expectation of so many guests, and that they would find such other accommodations provided as might in some degree support the ancient hospitality of Tullyveoline. It is impossible to describe the pleasure which this assurance gave the Baron, who, with an air of gallantry half appertaining to the stiff Scottish lad, and half to the officer in the French service, offered his arm to the fair speaker and led the way, in something between a stride and a minute step, into the large dining parlour, followed by all the rest of the good company. By dint of Saunderson's directions and exertions, all here, as well as in the other apartments, had been disposed as much as possible according to the old arrangement, and where new movables had been necessary, they had been selected in the same character with the old furniture. There was one addition to this fine old apartment, however, which drew tears to the Baron's eyes. It was a large and spirited painting representing Fergus MacIvor and Waverley in their Highland dress, the scene a wild, rocky, and mountainous pass, down which the clan were descending in the background. It was taken from a spirited sketch, drawn while they were in Edinburgh by a young man of high genius, and had been painted on a full-length scale by an eminent London artist. Rayburn himself, whose Highland chiefs do all but walk out of the canvas, could not have done more justice to the subject, and the ardent, fiery, and impetuous character of the unfortunate chief of Glennaquoich was finely contrasted with the contemplative, fanciful, and enthusiastic expression of his happier friend. Besides this painting hung the arms which Waverley had borne in the unfortunate civil war. The whole piece was beheld with admiration and deeper feelings. Men must, however, eat, in spite of both sentiment and virtue, and the Baron, while he assumed the lower end of the table, insisted that Lady Emily should do the honours of the head, that they might, he said, set a meet example to the young folk. After a pause of deliberation, employed in adjusting in his own brain the precedence between the Presbyterian Kirk and Episcopal Church of Scotland, he requested Mr. Morton, as the stranger, would crave a blessing, observing that Mr. Rubrick, who was at home, would return thanks for the distinguished mercies it had been his lot to experience. The dinner was excellent. Saunderson attended in full costume, with all the former domestics who had been collected, excepting 1 or 2 that had not been heard of since the affair of Culloden. The cellars were stocked with wine, which was pronounced to be superb, and it had been contrived that the bear of the fountain in the courtyard should, for that night only, play excellent brandy punch for the benefit of the lower orders. When the dinner was over, the Baron, about to propose a toast, cast a somewhat sorrowful look upon the sideboard, which however exhibited much of his plate, and had either been secreted or purchased by neighbouring gentlemen from the soldiery, and by them gladly restored to the original owner. "In the late times," he said, "those must be thankful to have saved life and land, yet when I am about to pronounce this toast, I cannot but regret an old heirloom, Lady Emily, a Poculum Praetorium, Colonel Talbot." Here the Baron's elbow was gently touched by his major domo, and turning around he beheld in the hands of Alexander ab Alexandro the celebrated cup of Saint Duthac, the blessed bear of Bradwardine. I question if the recovery of his estate afforded him more rapture. "By my honour," he said, "one might almost believe in brownies and fairies. Lady Emily, when your ladyship is in presence—" "I am truly happy," said Colonel Talbot, "that by the recovery of this piece of your family antiquity it has fallen within my power to give you some token of my deep interest in all that concerns my young friend Edward. But that you may not suspect Lady Emily for a sorceress, or me for a conjurer, which is no joke in Scotland, I must tell you that Frank Stanley, your friend, who has been seized with a tartan fever ever since he heard Edward's tales of old Scottish manners, happened to describe to us at second hand this remarkable cup. My servant Spontoon, who, like a true old soldier, observes everything and says little, gave me afterwards to understand that he thought he had seen the piece of plate Mr. Stanley mentioned in the possession of a certain Mrs. Nosebag, who, having been originally the helpmate of a pawnbroker, had found opportunity during the late unpleasant scenes in Scotland to trade a little in her old line, and so became the depository of the more valuable part of the spoil of half the army. You may believe the cup was speedily recovered, and it will give me very great pleasure if you allow me to suppose that its value is not diminished by having been restored through my means." A tear mingled with the wine which the Baron filled, as he proposed a cup of gratitude to Colonel Talbot, and "the prosperity of the united houses of Waverley-Honour and Bradwardine." It only remains for me to say that, as no wish was ever uttered with more affectionate sincerity, there are a few which, allowing for the necessary mutability of human events, have been upon the whole more happily fulfilled. Chapter 71. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England. Section 37 of Waverley, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since, Volume 2 by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 72. A Postscript, which should have been a Preface. Our journey is now finished, gentle reader, and if your patience has accompanied me through these sheets, the contract is, on your part, strictly fulfilled. Yet, like the driver who has received his full hire, I still linger near you, and make, with becoming diffidence, a trifling additional claim upon your bounty and good nature. You are as free, however, to shut the volume of the one petitioner as to close your door in the face of another. This should be a prefatory chapter, but for two reasons. First, that most novel readers, as my own conscience reminds me, are apt to be guilty of the sin of omission respecting that same matter of prefaces. Secondly, that it is a general custom with that class of students to begin with the last chapter of a work, so that, after all, these remarks, being introduced in last order, have still the best chance to be read in their proper place. There is no European nation which, within the course of half a century or little more, has undergone so complete a change as this kingdom of Scotland. The effects of the insurrection of 1745, the destruction of the patriarchal power of the Highland chiefs, the abolition of the heritable jurisdictions of the Lowland nobility and barons, the total eradication of the Jacobite party, which, adverse to intermingle with the English or adopt their customs, long continued to pride themselves upon maintaining ancient Scottish manners and customs, commenced this invocation. The gradual influx of wealth and extension of commerce has since united to render the present people of Scotland a class of beings as different from their grandfathers as the existing English are from those of Queen Elizabeth's time. The political and economical effects of these changes have been traced by Lord Selkirk with great precision and accuracy, but the change, though steadily and rapidly progressive, has nevertheless been gradual, and like those who drift down the stream of a deep and smooth river, we are not aware of the progress we have made until we fix our eye on the now distant point from which we have been drifted. Such of the present generation as can recollect the last 20 or 25 years of the 18th century will be fully sensible of the truth of this statement, especially if their acquaintance and connections lay among those who in my younger time were facetiously called fogs of the old leaven, who still cherished a lingering though hopeless attachment to the house of Stuart. This race has now almost entirely vanished from the land, and with it, doubtless, much observed political prejudice, but also many living examples of singular and disinterested attachment to the principles of loyalty which they received from their fathers, and of old Scottish faith, hospitality, worth, and honour. It was my accidental lot, though not born a Highlander, which may be an apology for much bad Gaelic, to reside during my childhood and youth among persons of the above description, and now, for the purpose of preserving some idea of the ancient manners of which I have witnessed the almost total extinction, I have embroidered the imaginary scenes, and ascribed to fictitious characters a part of the incidents which I then received from those who were actors in them. Indeed, the most romantic parts of this narrative are precisely those which have a foundation in fact. The exchange of mutual protection between a Highland gentleman and an officer of rank in the King's service, together with the spirited manner in which the latter asserted his right to return the favour he had received, is literally true. The ancient by a musket shot, and the heroic reply imputed to Flora, relate to a lady of rank not long deceased, and scarce a gentleman who was in hiding after the battle of Culloden, but could tell a tale of strange concealments and of wild and hair's-breadth scrapes as extraordinary as any which I have ascribed to my heroes. Of this the escapes of Charles Edward himself, and the most prominent, is the most striking example. The accounts of the battle at Preston and skirmish at Clifton are taken from the narrative of intelligent eyewitnesses, and corrected from the history of the rebellion by the late venerable author of Douglas. The Lowland Scottish gentlemen and the subordinate characters are not given as individual portraits, but are drawn from the general habits of the period, of which I have witnessed some remnants in my younger days, and partly gathered from tradition. It has been my object to describe these persons, not by a caricatured and exaggerated use of the national dialect, but by their habits, manners, and feelings, so as in some distant degree to emulate the admirable Irish portraits drawn by Miss Edgeworth, so different from the Teagues and dear Joys, who so long, with the most perfect family resemblance to each other, occupied the drama and the novel. I feel no confidence, however, in the manner in which I have executed my purpose. Indeed, so little was I satisfied with my production, that I laid it aside in an unfinished state, and only found it again by mere accident, among other waste papers in an old cabinet, the drawers of which I was rummaging in order to accommodate a friend with some fishing tackle, after it had been mislaid for several years. Two works upon similar subjects, by female authors whose genius is highly creditable to their country, have appeared in the interval. I mean Mrs. Hamilton's Glenburnie and the late account of Highland superstitions, but the first is confined to the rural habits of Scotland, of which it has given a picture with striking and impressive fidelity, and the traditional records of the respectable and ingenious Mrs. Grant of Laggan are of a nature distinct from the fictitious narrative which I have here attempted. I would willingly persuade myself that the preceding work will not be found altogether uninteresting. To elder persons it will recall scenes and characters familiar to their youth, and to the rising generation the tale may present some idea of the manners of their forefathers. Yet I heartily wish that the task of tracing the evanescent manners of his own country had employed the pen of the only man in Scotland who could have done it justice, of him so eminently distinguished in elegant literature, and whose sketches of colonial caustic and Umphraville are perfectly blended with the finer traits of national character. I should in that case have had more pleasure as a reader than I shall ever feel in the pride of a successful author, should these sheets confer upon me that envied distinction. And as I have inverted the usual arrangement, placing these remarks at the end of the work to which they refer, I will venture on a second violation of form, by closing the whole with a dedication. These volumes being respectfully inscribed to our Scottish Addison, Henry Mackenzie, by an unknown admirer of his genius. End of chapter 72. End of Waverley, or 60 Years Since, Volume 2, by Sir Walter Scott. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England.